Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and we start out here in the direction of Bakhmut, where to the west of the city in the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have made a significant advance here in the forest patch, capturing almost the entirety of the eastern part of it. With this, the fighting has aligned with the crossing itself here across the canal. The Russians are fighting over their ability to cross over and start a foothold across to start fighting in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar by the city itself. At the same time, in the northern flank, the Russians have advanced within the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar by the outskirts, where they've managed to capture the first few buildings and containers here to the northern parts by the Dacha area, getting full control over the forest patch and pushing into it after withdrawing from the eastern outskirts of the city area. As is confirmed with this geolocated footage, the objective of the Russians here is also to gain control over the forest patch to the north on flank of Chasiv Yar, to be able to attack from both sides, both from the northern and southern side, to not put all of their abilities in one section. We then move on to the next section of the front line, which is here to the north of Avdiivka, where the Russians have had this massive advance in the direction of Arkhangelsk. The Russians managed to push out the Ukrainians and capture all of these fortifications to the south of the village before connecting their assaults from the eastern parts with the ones from the south to then gain a foothold within Arkhangelsk and avoid the Ukrainian fortifications to the west of the village. It is likely over the next few days that the Russians will continue pushing in a northern direction to again bypass the Ukrainian fortifications and move on to the next set of them to cut them off and create a similar situation to the Ukrainian fortifications here in between Novokalinovo and Ocheretine by cutting them off and forcing them to withdraw or leaving them with no exit. The fighting here is very significant that the Russians have managed to gain so much control over just a few days, and with this we see that the Russian foothold across the northern parts of Avdiivka is significantly increasing over the past month, and one day the Russians have managed to capture about 60 square kilometers north of Avdiivka, and the fighting continues in the village of Arkhangelsk. Following the capture of Arkhangelsk, it is likely that the Russians will then push on to Novo-Oleksandrivka, and we're already seeing fighting in the direction of Sokil. West of Solovyov, in the direction of Sokil, the Russians have captured yet another forest line and captured the Ukrainian fortifications in between the two villages, leaving only one singular line of defense left before the Russians reach Sokil. The difficulty of Sokil for the Russians is that the Ukrainians have fortifications to the north of the village located in the high grounds. This overlooks the whole village and makes it very difficult for the Russians to gain a foothold if they simply move through the highway or the road through between Solovyov and Sokil. Gaining a position would be very difficult as the Ukrainians would have an overlooking defensible position to the north. So it is more likely that the Russians will continue pushing here west of Ocheretine to flank the Ukrainian positions and attack them from the northern side, which would be taking advantage of the recent Russian advances to push through to gain control over the fortifications here to the south of the recent advances of the Russians. Gaining them here and the west of that as well will then allow the Russians to push down south towards the Ukrainian fortifications from the high ground. This will also allow them to flank the Ukrainian fortifications pointing in the eastern direction from the northern direction, which would make it less viable. So with this, we see that there's likely going to be a combined strike by the Russians from the east and from the north to gain as much of an advantage as possible to push into Sokil and start the battle over Sokil, Voshkod, and Yevhenivka here to the west of Solovyov. This will start a fight over the next village chain, and as we can see, Novoselivka Persha and Novopokrovsk in the center are going to be further isolated from such an attack, as it would only have supply lines going in a western direction rather than connecting it to the north as well. This will allow the Russians to attack from multiple directions from the north through Sokil, Voshkod, and Yevhenivka, from the northeast through Novopokrovsk, which the Russians are also attacking at with the recent advance southwest of Solovyov, from the direction of Semenivka directly towards Novoselivka Persha, and if the Russians continue advancing here in the south, from Umansky and in a northern direction, which will allow the Russians to attack from every single direction. The idea of Umansk as well is a very important defensive position for the Ukrainians, because not only do they have the high grounds and fortifications available, but it also has a road connected from Umansk and to Skushne to then flank the Ukrainian positions completely by going along the lake. So with this, there would be significant consequences for the Ukrainians if they do lose Umansk. So we're seeing that the situation here by Ocheretino is developing similar to Popasna, where the Russians are able to advance in pretty much every single direction due to the strategic location of Ocheretino, and the Russians are taking full advantage of it by sending additional thousands of reinforcements to the village to continue these offensive operations as they look to advance and develop it into a larger offensive than it already is, and to expand their zone of control. We are seeing that the Russians are getting closer and closer to cities like Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, where the distance between those and the front line are similar to that between Donetsk and the front line, as the advances by the Russians have significantly improved over the past few days due to the Ukrainian collapse of the front, where we're seeing that units such as the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 3rd Azov Brigade are unable to be sent to the front due to the losses they've suffered over the past few weeks, making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to plug the gaps with just regular soldiers, allowing the Russians to constantly advance, where yet again another day of about 12 square kilometers of advancements for the Russians in a singular day. That is something we were not seeing since the start of the year until just the past few days. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Novomikhailivka, Russian offensive operations have started again, where there's been small advancements here west of Novomikhailivka towards Pereskovivka and Konstantinivka, and expanding from the fortifications the Russians got control of. As for the south of Novomikhailivka, we see here in between Konstantinivka and Volodar, the Russians have made this advance here, where they're pushing towards the road between the two towns in an attempt to hit the Ukrainian supply and connection between the two. This will allow the Russians to impact heavy pressure on both of these towns ahead of attacking either one of them. The idea or plan of the Russians here is to push towards Konstantinivka as well as Volodar, both gaining control over both of these before a Russian offensive. This is to prevent the Ukrainians from launching any counterattacks in this section of the front line and create a buffer zone here in the southern parts of Donetsk. It is unlikely that the Russians have an interest in gaining significant advancements here in the southern part of Donetsk. It is instead more likely that they will try to push and focus in the northern parts towards Kudahove, which the Ukrainians have significantly fortified, to gain access to the railway connection between it and Pokrovsk, push further in the direction of Krasnodarivka to gain control of that as well, before moving through Pervomaiske and Netailove towards Pokrovsk from there. In the direction of Ocheretino, there's a focus on both a western direction and a northern direction towards both of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. The direction of Joseph Yar getting control of that would then again allow the Russians to push towards Konstantinivka. So it is clear that the Russian offensive would have a focus on Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, while a prerequisite for either of those attacks would be to capture these cities here in the south, to release many Russian soldiers, create a buffer zone, and allow the Russians to focus on these two directions solely in the section of the front line of the Donetsk region. In the direction of Urashchina to the south, there are further Russian advances in the direction of the village itself, gaining a foothold further within it and pushing the Ukrainians out of the southern outskirts, gaining control over the forest lines here to the south of the village, which will improve the Russian positions in the area. This could be a restart of offensive operations by the Russians to gain control of Urashchina and Staromayorsk in the section of the front line, pushing the Ukrainians further back and recreating this buffer zone in between the Russian and Ukrainian lines. This area is very difficult to supply due to its far proximity to any sort of viable supply lines, which makes it difficult for the Russians to push through in the section of the front line due to the lack of the ability to supply a larger army for more artillery and more units to fight at the front line. So it is likely that if fighting continues and the Russians attempt to gain re-control over these areas, it will either be fast because of a Ukrainian withdrawal or slow due to heavy fighting taking place and the limit of the strength being used in the area. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.